concept of consideration now. So I just need to, can we just start so so consideration, up until this point, we have referred to consideration as price. So I just want to introduce the concept and then we'll spend quite a lot of time with consideration next week. So consideration is a precondition, it's a formation element. And what we'll be doing is working out what it is, how we recognise it in the wild, and why it matters. So, I don't know why that's sitting there like that. Anyway, I'll get there. I think that consideration, we can think about it in a fairly formulaic way. The doctrine of consideration requires that something must be given in return for a promise in order to make it, as in the promise, binding. So let's think about the example I've used a number of times, buying a cup of coffee. What kind of a contract is the purchase of a cup of coffee? Is it unilateral or bilateral? Bilateral. In other words, at the point in time when the contract is made, two parties, a vendor of coffee and a purchaser of coffee, both have obligations. What is the vendor's obligation? Make, hand over the coffee, provide coffee, deliver coffee. What is the purchaser's obligation? Pay money. Okay, so what we've got there is an exchange. So we've got two promises. A promise to deliver coffee that is exchanged for a promise to pay money. What is the consideration for the promise to pay money? The promise to deliver coffee. What is the consideration for the promise to deliver coffee? The promise to pay money. Now, these words, in fact, I haven't got the exact words. The words your textbook uses is consideration is the price for the promise. You guys are smarter than me. You might understand that. I find that really dense language. Consideration is the price for the promise. I think the easiest way to think about consideration is consideration moves two ways. I make you a promise and I am obliged to keep that promise because I've made it in exchange for a promise that you made me. You made me a promise. You are obliged to keep that promise because you made that promise in exchange for a promise I made you. We are swapping promises. Now, sometimes there's only a microsecond in between the promise being made and the price being paid for it. Or, sorry, the promise being made and it being fulfilled. So basically, consideration is usually taken for granted. We're going to spend a week and a half talking about it effectively, but it's very rarely an issue in real world because the very nature of a contract is you buy something, you pay for it. The nature of a contract is that there is a price paid. But price isn't always money. Sometimes we swap promises. I'll mow your lawn, you walk my dog. I will deliver services for teaching and you will bring wine. That would be good. I think that would be a social one. Sometimes the exchange is of things, but mostly in a bilateral contract sense, we are talking about exchange of promises. So let's think about a unilateral contract. Why is a unilateral contract? We've used some examples before of a reward for a lost dog. I find your dog. I return it to you. There's been a poster somewhere that says you will pay me $100 or pay the person who returns your dog $100 as a reward. At what point in time is the contract made? When I return your lost dog. What is the consideration paid for the return of the dog? $100. What is the consideration for the $100? Returning the dog. Still works the same, it's just not a promise. And there are no promises, there is just a straight out obligation. So there is, at the point the contract is made, there is an obligation to pay the $100. The promise and the consideration are made before the contract is made. So it's not a swapping of promises in that standard sense. So why do we have it? It's been around for a very long time, and we started today with some consideration of why some of the cases are so old. It's a 16th century idea that in order for a serious promise to be made, it needed to be made in consideration of some other factor, in response to. Promises ultimately came to be enforceable when a promisee, so the beneficiary of a promise, confers some benefit on the person making the promise, or they've acted to their own detriment in some way. So this idea that it's an important thing entering into a contract, that it's not a gratuitous thing. There needs to be some kind of exchange or benefit. So this is my sort of statement about the potential for a formula, and this is my kind of flow chart of working out how we deal with consideration. So usually our question ultimately is whether there's legally sufficient consideration. And next week we'll talk about the difference between valuable consideration and legally sufficient consideration. But at the moment, we're not thinking about value, whether it's the right price. We just think about whether or not there is consideration, whether there is sufficient price. So there are two ways that we have to head, and we need to deal with both of them. Firstly, we need to consider whether or not, and the authority here is Curry and Mesa, whether there is a matching of a benefit and a detriment. In order for me to get the benefit of your promise, I need to suffer or incur some kind of detriment. And then the second part of this is the bargain or the exchange requirement. And we return to our old friend Australian Woolen Mills, which is a case we discussed a couple of weeks ago. Is the promise that you made me a response to or an exchange or a swap for a promise I made you? Is there an exchange? Is it part of the bargain? Or are they independent promises which in fact would not be consideration? So as we look down this line, we're going to look at what the promises are and what that means to confer a benefit or give rise to a legal detriment. And we're going to distinguish on the other side the difference between exchange and reliance. And particularly we'll look at Beaton, or McDivitt and Beaton. I just love having a case where parties came to blows over a Tai Chi incident. It's one of my favourite cases. But we need to understand the difference between the estoppel argument, the reliance argument, and that exchange. And then, of course, as is the way with the law, we will learn what the law is by identifying what it is not. We're going to go through all of the exceptions. So we have a general rule, and you'll find this in other subjects as well, where there is a rule, a blanket rule, and then we have the carve-outs or the exceptions that we need to deal with. So they include consideration needs to move from the promisee, but it doesn't necessarily have to go to the promisor. Consideration needs to be adequate. It doesn't need to be adequate, but it does need to be sufficient. Doesn't that just sound like when your mum said to you, "'Cause I said so"? Like it makes no sense at all, but we'll make sense of it. Past consideration is not good consideration. Again, that is actually very closely aligned with this idea that consideration needs to be an exchange for or part of the bargain. It can't be something that has been done before, but of course there are exceptions, most of which I think you will find are largely racist or sexist, but they're like exceptions nonetheless. Part payment of a debt is not good consideration, and performance of a pre-existing legal duty will also not be good consideration. In many ways, past payment of a debt is like a subset of the existing legal duty rule. So, and both of them are very caught up in this idea of the bargain requirement too. So if you already have an obligation to do something, the fact you're obliged to do that or you've promised to do that is not consideration for another promise. You can't sort of, you know, have your cake and eat it too, so to speak. There are, of course, exceptions to the exceptions. We will talk about those. And the one I want to start with is actually the exception from the very beginning, which is we don't even need to ask ourselves the question about consideration if we have a deed or if a promissory estoppel occurs. So let's look at it from that. If we have a deed or a promissory estoppel, we actually don't even need to worry about whether there's a consideration or not. Now, one of those things we can control, the other one, we're just hoping against all hope that a court agrees with us. So a deed is actually up to us. When we're making a transaction, if we think that there might be an issue with finding consideration or a court seeing consideration down the track, then we might want to document the arrangement with a deed so that we no longer need consideration. But a promissory estoppel, what we're effectively doing there is saying, okay, this is such a mess, we're going to go to court and get a judge in equity to say that it would be unfair for the other side to claim a right that they have because of some equity, which will result in us not needing consideration. That is a long-winded way of me saying that if you write in an assignment, I'll just set up this deal so that there is a promissory estoppel and then we won't have to worry about consideration, I will not be impressed. Because clearly that's not something that you can control or that you would want to control. And a deed is really easy. So why a deed? So I think I've got a slide on deeds. Oh, heading the wrong way? Oh, sorry, I'll just flick through to my deed slide because we're not going to have time to talk about all this. That's right, I was clearly going to... yeah, here's what I want to talk about. Sorry, I was clearly going to do those one by one instead of point my pointer at them. So consideration fits in this space between something being a gift, being gratuitous, and something that is a commercial exchange. So a commercial exchange is something we understand a contract to be. Commercial people enter into contracts, they buy things and sell things. There is an exchange of money for goods, money for services, goods for services, services for money, whatever it happens to be. On the other side of the spectrum, people who know each other and are family members or are good friends, they might exchange things all the time, but they've got no intention of ever being bound by. There's no contractual requirement. They do that because of their social or their family relationship or their philanthropy, or their intention is that the promises they make are gratuitous, that there is no exchange for them, but they are also, their intention is that they won't be bound, that they can't be sued if it turns out that they don't give to that charity every year after all, or whatever they happen to do. Consideration issues tend to fall in the middle where there's a lack of clarity about, is it supposed to be gratuitous or is it really a commercial exchange? So the preeminent case here comes from Justice Lash in Curry and Mesa. A valuable consideration in the sense of the law may consist in some right, interest, profit or benefit accruing to one party, or some forbearance, detriment, loss or responsibility given, suffered or undertaken by the other. So this idea that if you get something, you give something. If you give something, you get something. From our textbook, the benefit conferred on the promisor or the detriment suffered by the promisee must be given in return for the promise. So it's not enough for it just to be a benefit detriment. It needs to be, they need to be related to each other. The benefit or the detriment need to relate to the deal at hand. So, no, I don't want to go there yet. I just want to make this point at the end about consideration and get to deeds, and then I'll let you go. Consideration, why is it required at all? Ultimately, the old cases, and this is very much a common law thing, by the way. There are many other jurisdictions that don't require consideration. And in fact, as long ago as 1937, and you will have seen this from some of the reading, I think it's 1937, you can correct me on the date, the UK had a commission that said, yeah, it's outdated, we don't need consideration anymore. We don't think it's actually appropriate anymore. In civil law jurisdictions, you can be bound to a contract even if there is no consideration or equivalent to consideration. So it's a peculiarly common law idea. So why do we have it? It goes to this idea of whether a contract is an enforceable agreement or just an agreement of some sort. Is it something that the courts will enforce? It's concerned with the validity of the promise. And it's connected to this idea that if a promise has been paid for, if there is some kind of reliance as a consequence of that payment, then that payment has a special value, that it should be enforced. Oh, sorry. Now I'm going to go here. So I've clearly got my slides in the wrong order. I don't like it when the way I'm pulling things together is I'm not working with my slides. So what is detriment? Detriment is just somebody giving something up, offer or get something. The thing needs to be that what they've agreed to. So this goes back to this idea of offer. So offer needs to contain what I like to call the DNA of the deal. So the offer needs to be capable of acceptance on its face without variation, because if we vary it, it becomes a counter offer and it's not actually an acceptance. So I think it was one of those American judges, a really nice definition. An offer needs to contain everything so that the offeree knows that by agreeing to it, by assenting to it, a contract is made, which means it needs to contain what the price is. It needs to contain what the consideration will be, whether that is, well, for both sides ultimately. So, bargain just means agreement. Promise performance, which is sought by the promisor. The promises induce each other. So thinking about consideration as something that moves both ways. Consideration is, as the textbook says, price of the promise. This is not where I want to be. Okay, I'm just going to ignore that. We'll finish up. I thought I had a slide on deeds, which is clearly I've hidden or something or other. Think about, too, why a deed is an acceptable way of having a contract without having consideration. If we think about the price or that demonstration as an exchange of benefit detriment as making the contract enforceable, making it something that a court will hear, then the act of signing a deed is just effectively a ceremony or a ritual that brings people's mind to the idea that this is a serious undertaking. Just the same way that paying money, and we'll talk about adequacy and sufficiency next week, but that it's basically the same thing, whether it's nominal consideration or a deed. So back in the day, a deed was only effective if it was written on vellum. So vegans were not keen on the old deeds. Vellum is deer skin. They need to be signed, sealed and delivered. So signed basically doesn't really mean anything, because back in the absolute days, so few people could write their own name, that any kind of mark that signified the human who was undertaking the obligation was enough. Sealed was literally that, the wax seal, the stamp, the thing that said this is complete. And delivery, which is still an obligation under deeds, means the actual doing of something that says to the world, I agree to be bound by this. In a law firm situation, that often means physical delivery of documents. Less so these days because they're all happening electronically, right? But you would bind it up and you would physically deliver it. You would swap them. So deeds often not signed by both parties. You will have two counterparts. Each party will sign their own, and delivery will happen when you swap them. So you've got one that the other party has signed, and they've got the one that you've signed. So again, there's a ceremony to it, which similarly to consideration is a way of saying to the court, Our intention was to be legally bound. So I want you to just have that in the back of your mind as you trawl through the consideration and you think about sufficiency and adequacy, because that can do your head in a little bit. Cases that we'll particularly concentrate on next week, and I'd really like you guys to have a view on, because I know your assignments left, right and centre and we're getting to the stage where we're skimming. I'd really like to have a robust conversation about Kirby's judgment in Woolworths. And I'll have a think about if anything else that really wants to come up, and I will make sure I highlight the cases in my email when I send around the recording so that I know you're able to be prepared for that conversation. Thank you for a lovely afternoon, evening, and you know how to contact me if you've got questions about the assignment.